The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 11 times as Richard Sterling sat in his home office, reviewing quarterly reports for Sterling Construction, the company he had built from nothing over 35 years. At 62, he had achieved everything he'd dreamed of as a young man. A successful business, a beautiful home in suburban Denver, financial security that would last several lifetimes. What he didn't have, he was beginning to realize, was a wife who loved him. The revelation hadn't come suddenly. It had been building for months through small signs he'd chosen to ignore. Catherine's increasing distance, her disinterest in their conversations about business or travel, the way she looked through him rather than at him during dinner. But tonight those subtle indicators had crystallized into words that would haunt him forever. "Richard, we need to talk." Catherine had appeared in his office doorway, looking elegant as always, her silver hair perfectly styled, wearing the pearl necklace he had given her for their 25th anniversary. At 58, she remained the beautiful woman he had fallen in love with 3 decades ago, but something in her eyes had changed irreversibly. "Of course, sweetheart. What's on your mind?" She had settled into the leather chair across from his desk with the careful composure of someone delivering rehearsed lines. "I want a divorce." The words hit Richard like a physical blow, but he maintained his composure. 30 years of marriage had taught him to listen first, react second. "Can you help me understand why?" "Because I'm tired of pretending," Catherine said, her voice steady and emotionless. "Tired of playing the role of the grateful wife who's thrilled to be married to the successful businessman. Tired of living a lie." "A lie?" Richard's voice remained calm, but his hands had begun to tremble slightly. "Catherine, what are you talking about?" She looked at him with something approaching pity. "Richard, you've given me everything money can buy. This house, jewelry, cars, vacations to places I never asked to visit. You've been a good provider, a faithful husband, a decent man. Oh, but I don't love you. I haven't loved you for years. Maybe I never really loved you the way a wife should love her husband." The admission hung in the air between them like a death sentence. Richard felt 30 years of shared memories, sacrifices, and what he had believed was mutual devotion, crumbling beneath the weight of her honesty. "I don't understand," he said quietly. "If you felt this way, why did you stay? Why did we renew our vows 5 years ago? Why did you tell me just last month that you were happy?" Catherine's composure cracked slightly. "Because I was comfortable. Because divorce seemed complicated and expensive and socially awkward. Because I thought maybe I could learn to be content with a marriage based on security rather than love. And now I realize I can't. I'm 58 years old, Richard. I have maybe 20 good years left, and I don't want to spend them in a marriage where I'm constantly pretending to feel something I don't." Richard stood and walked to the window overlooking the garden Catherine had spent years cultivating. The irony wasn't lost on him that she had poured more passion into her roses than she had ever shown for their relationship. "Is there someone else?" "No," she said immediately. "This isn't about another man. This is about the fact that when you touch me, I feel nothing. When you talk about your business achievements or your plans for our future, I feel trapped. When you look at me with love in your eyes, I feel guilty because I can't return it." The brutal honesty was somehow worse than infidelity would have been. An affair could be forgiven, worked through, overcome. But this fundamental absence of love felt insurmountable. 30 years, Richard said, still looking out the window. 30 years of what I thought was a good marriage. Were you ever happy, Catherine? Were there ever moments when you actually loved me? She was quiet for so long that he turned around to look at her. Tears were running down her cheeks, the first genuine emotion she had shown all evening. In the beginning, maybe. Or maybe I just loved the idea of being loved by someone like you. You were so determined to take care of me, so committed to building a life together. I think I confused being cherished with being in love, and I confused providing for you with making you happy. Yes, she whispered. But Richard, that's not your fault. You've been everything a husband should be. The failure is mine. Richard returned to his chair, studying the woman he had shared his life with for 3 decades. She was being brutally honest, and he found himself respecting her for it, even as her words destroyed him. What do you want from me, Catherine? How do you want to handle this? I want to be fair. I want to divide everything equitably. I don't want to hurt you any more than I already have. And then what? What does your life look like after we divorce? Catherine looked surprised by the question. I don't know yet. I want to travel, maybe. See places I've always wanted to visit. Maybe take art classes, volunteer with causes that matter to me. Figure out who I am when I'm not Richard Sterling's wife. The phrase hit him harder than anything else she had said. For 30 years, she had been Richard Sterling's wife, and apparently she had experienced it as a prison rather than a partnership. There's something else, Catherine said, her voice becoming even quieter. Something I need to tell you, and it's going to hurt. Richard braced himself for another revelation, another layer of deception to be peeled away. Last week, when we were at the Hendersons' anniversary party, you introduced me to that new client of yours, David Martinez. Do you remember what you said? Richard recalled the evening. Martinez was a potential client for a major commercial development project, and Richard had been proud to have Catherine by his side, as always elegant and charming. I said you were the secret to my success, that behind every successful man was a woman who made it all worthwhile. And do you remember what I said? Richard's memory was vaguer on this point. Catherine had made some polite response, smiled at Martinez, played her role as the supportive wife perfectly. You said something about being grateful for our life together. What I actually said, Catherine's voice broke slightly, was that I was grateful to be part of your success story, and Martinez looked at me with such pity, like he could see right through the performance. Catherine, no, let me finish. After you walked away to get drinks, Martinez asked me if I was happy, just like that, out of nowhere, and I couldn't answer him, Richard. I stood there for 30 seconds, trying to form the words, yes, I'm happy, and I couldn't do it. What did you tell him? I told him that happiness was complicated, and he said something that's been haunting me ever since. Richard waited, knowing that whatever came next would be the final nail in the coffin of their marriage. He said, Mom, I've been married 42 years, and happiness isn't complicated at all. Either you light up when your husband walks into a room, or you don't. Either you can't wait to tell him about your day, or you don't. Either touching him feels like coming home, or it doesn't. Richard felt something die inside his chest. He knew, without asking, which category Catherine fell into. And that's when I realized, Catherine continued, that I had spent 30 years of my life pretending to light up when you walked into rooms, pretending to care about your business stories, pretending that your touch felt like anything other than an obligation. They sat in silence for several minutes, the weight of 3 decades of emotional dishonesty settling between them like a wall. So, what happens now? Richard asked finally. Now we figure out how to end this marriage with as much dignity and fairness as possible. I don't want your money, Richard. I don't want half of everything you've built. I just want my freedom. Catherine, you're entitled to half of everything, legally, morally. I don't want it, she interrupted firmly. I want enough to start over, to be comfortable, but I don't want to profit from a marriage I should have ended years ago. Richard studied his wife, soon-to-be ex-wife, with new eyes. Even in asking for a divorce, even in admitting she had never truly loved him, she was trying to be fair, trying to minimize the damage to his life and legacy. "There's one more thing I need to ask you," Richard said quietly. "What?" "When you said Martinez looked at you with pity, what did you see in his eyes that made you think he understood?" Catherine was quiet for a long moment. "Love," she said finally. "When he looked at me, I could see that he was thinking about his own wife, about how much he loved her, and I realized that in 30 years I had never seen that look in your eyes when you thought about me. I've seen gratitude, pride, contentment, satisfaction, but never the kind of love that Martinez has for his wife." The conversation continued for another hour, but the essential damage was done. By midnight, they had agreed on the basic terms of their divorce: an amicable split, joint custody of their assets, and a commitment to maintaining dignity throughout the process. As Richard finally went to bed that night, alone for the first time in their marriage, Catherine having moved to the guest room, he replayed the evening's conversation in his mind. The brutal honesty of it, the realization that his life's greatest success story had been built on a foundation of emotional pretense. But as he lay in the darkness, something unexpected began to take shape in his mind, an idea that went beyond divorce settlements and asset division. An idea that would either be seen as the greatest act of love of his life or the most foolish gesture a man could make. Catherine had said she didn't want his money, but she did want her freedom. She wanted to discover who she was when she wasn't Richard Sterling's wife. What if he could give her more than just a divorce? What if he could give her the chance to become everything she had dreamed of being, without the financial constraints that might limit her options? What if, instead of just ending their marriage, he could transform her entire life? The idea was audacious, unprecedented, and possibly insane. But as Richard finally drifted off to sleep, he found himself planning the most important business deal of his life, one where the only return on investment he wanted was his wife's genuine happiness, even if it meant she would never be his wife again. 3 weeks after that devastating conversation, Richard Sterling sat across from James Morrison, his attorney for over 20 years, in the law offices of Morrison, Reed and Associates. Between them lay a stack of documents that would have surprised anyone who knew about Richard's impending divorce, including Catherine herself. "Richard, I have to ask you one more time," James said, removing his glasses and rubbing his temples. "Are you absolutely certain about this? Because once these papers are filed, there's no undoing what you're proposing." "I've never been more certain of anything in my life," Richard replied, his voice steady, despite the magnitude of what he was about to do. The documents outlined an arrangement that went far beyond a typical divorce settlement. Instead of the standard division of assets, Richard was proposing to give Catherine something unprecedented: complete ownership of Sterling Construction, the company he had built from nothing over 35 years. "Let me make sure I understand this correctly," James said, flipping through the papers. "You're giving Catherine the entire company, worth approximately $47 million, along with the house, all investments, and a $10 million cash settlement for what you're calling transition expenses." "That's correct." "Richard, this is insane. Even in the most generous divorce settlements, we're talking about 50%. You're giving her everything and keeping virtually nothing for yourself." "I'm keeping my freedom, my dignity, and my peace of mind," Richard said calmly. "Besides, I'm not keeping nothing. I'm keeping the ranch in Montana, the cabin at Lake Tahoe, and enough liquid assets to live comfortably for the rest of my life." James leaned back in his chair, studying his longtime client. "This isn't about being generous, is it? This is about something else entirely." Richard walked to the window overlooking downtown Denver's business district, a skyline partially shaped by buildings his company had constructed over the decades. "James, 3 weeks ago my wife told me she never loved me, that our entire marriage was a performance she maintained because it was comfortable and socially acceptable. Do you know what that does to a man who thought he had built a successful life? I can imagine it's devastating." "It is. But it's also liberating in a strange way. For 30 years I worked 18-hour days thinking I was building something for us, for our future together. Every success, every achievement, every dollar I earned was motivated by the belief that I was creating security and happiness for the woman I loved." Richard turned back toward James. "Now I know that woman never existed. The Catherine I loved was a performance, a role she played because she felt trapped by circumstances and social expectations. But here's what I've realized. I don't want to punish her for not loving me. I want to free her from the circumstances that made her feel trapped in the first place, by giving her your entire company, by giving her the power to make choices based on what she wants rather than what she needs. James, Catherine stayed married to me for 30 years because leaving seemed financially complicated and socially awkward. She performed love because the alternative felt impossible." Richard sat back down, his expression more animated than James had seen in weeks. But what if money wasn't a factor anymore? What if she had more resources than she could spend in several lifetimes? What if, for the first time in her adult life, every decision she made could be based purely on her own desires, her own dreams, her own definition of happiness? And you think this grand gesture will somehow win her back? No, Richard said firmly. This isn't about winning her back. It's about setting her free, really, truly free. And in doing so, setting myself free as well. James studied the documents again, shaking his head. "Richard, I've been practicing family law for 25 years, and I've never seen anything like this. Usually, divorce brings out the worst in people. Spite, greed, revenge, manipulation. You're proposing to give someone who hurt you more money and power than most people see in several lifetimes." Because she was honest with me, James. Brutally, painfully honest. She could have continued the charade for another decade. She could have had an affair and let me discover it. She could have gradually made my life miserable until I wanted out of the marriage. Instead, she told me the truth. The truth that she never loved you. The truth that freed me from a relationship based on illusion. Do you know what I've realized these past 3 weeks? I wasn't in love with Catherine either. I was in love with the idea of Catherine. I was in love with having a beautiful, elegant wife who made me look successful and complete. I was in love with the partnership I thought we had, not the person she actually was. James leaned forward, intrigued despite his professional concerns. "What do you mean?" "I mean, I couldn't tell you Catherine's favorite book, or what she dreams about, or what makes her laugh when she's alone. I knew she liked classical music, but I couldn't tell you her favorite composer. I knew she enjoyed art, but I couldn't name a single artist whose work moved her to tears." Richard's voice grew quieter. "I knew everything about Catherine Sterling, the wife I had created and maintained for 30 years. I knew nothing about Catherine Morrison, the woman she was before we married, or the woman she might become after we divorce." "So this is your way of finding out who she really is?" "This is my way of letting her find out who she really is. Without financial pressure, without social expectations, without any obligation to anyone, including me." James made notes on a legal pad, still processing the unprecedented nature of the arrangement. "There are some practical concerns we need to address. If you give Catherine control of Sterling Construction, what happens to your employees? Your existing contracts? Your legacy?" "I've thought about that extensively," Richard said, pulling out another folder. Sterling Construction employs 340 people directly and supports thousands more through subcontractors and suppliers. I'm not going to destroy lives because my marriage failed. He spread out the additional documents. I'm structuring the transfer so that Catherine receives ownership of the company, but operational control remains with our management team for the first 2 years. She'll receive all profits and have final say on major decisions, but day-to-day operations will continue unchanged. And after 2 years? After 2 years, she can choose to sell the company, maintain ownership as a passive investor, or take active control if she's interested. The choice will be entirely hers. James reviewed the operational structure, grudgingly impressed by the thoroughness of Richard's planning. You've really thought this through. I've had 3 weeks of sleepless nights to work out every detail. James, I built Sterling Construction from nothing because I was motivated by love, or what I thought was love. If Catherine truly owns it, she'll either find her own motivation to maintain and grow it, or she'll sell it to someone who will. Either way, it survives. And what about you? What's your plan for starting over at 62? Richard smiled for the first time since entering the office. I'm going to do something I haven't done in 35 years. Figure out what I actually want my life to look like, instead of what I think it should look like. Such as, I've always wanted to write a book about construction project management. I've been asked to teach at the university level. I've had offers to consult on major infrastructure projects. I've dreamed of traveling without worrying about quarterly reports and employee schedules. Richard's eyes lit up as he spoke. For 35 years, I defined myself as a husband and a business owner. Now, I get to discover who Richard Sterling is when he's just Richard. James made more notes, then looked up with concern. Richard, I have to ask, are you doing this because you're hoping Catherine will be so overwhelmed by your generosity that she'll change her mind about the divorce? No, Richard said without hesitation. I'm doing this because I want to see what happens when someone gets everything they need to pursue happiness without compromise. I'm curious about who Catherine becomes when she has unlimited resources and complete freedom. Even if who she becomes has nothing to do with you, especially if who she becomes has nothing to do with me. James leaned back, finally beginning to understand. This isn't really about Catherine, is it? This is about you proving to yourself that your capacity for love extends beyond possession and expectation. Maybe, or maybe it's about proving that 30 years of marriage, even a flawed marriage, created enough goodwill that I want her to have the best possible life, even if it's not with me. They spent the next 2 hours working through legal details, tax implications, and structural elements of the transfer. The complexity was staggering. Transferring ownership of a mid-sized construction company required corporate law expertise, tax planning, employment law considerations, and careful structuring to protect everyone involved. This will take several months to execute properly, James warned, and Catherine will need her own legal representation to review everything. You realize she might think you've lost your mind? She probably will, Richard agreed. But she'll also realize that for the first time in 30 years, she has choices that aren't constrained by financial considerations or social expectations. As they concluded the meeting, James asked one final question. Richard, what if this doesn't work out the way you're hoping? What if Catherine takes the money and assets and disappears from your life forever? What if you never see her again? Richard considered the question carefully. Then I'll know that I gave someone I cared about the gift of complete freedom, and I'll spend my remaining years knowing that I'm capable of love without conditions or expectations. That seems like a fair trade for $47 million and a construction company. And if she does something you disagree with, sells the company to competitors, makes decisions you think are wrong, then I'll know she's finally free to make her own mistakes and chart her own course. James, the worst thing about our marriage wasn't that Catherine didn't love me. It was that she felt obligated to pretend she did. I never want anyone to feel obligated to me again. As Richard left the law office that afternoon, he felt lighter than he had in months. The plan was audacious, financially irresponsible by conventional standards, and emotionally risky beyond measure. But it was also the first decision he had made in decades that felt completely authentic to who he wanted to be as a person. Tomorrow, he would present Catherine with the most unusual divorce settlement in legal history. He would offer her not just freedom from their marriage, but freedom from every constraint that had shaped her adult life. And then he would discover whether a love based on letting go was stronger than a marriage based on holding on. Catherine Sterling stood in the kitchen of the home she had shared with Richard for 15 years, staring at the divorce papers that had been delivered by messenger that morning. Her hands trembled as she read through the settlement terms for the third time, certain she was misunderstanding something fundamental about what Richard was proposing. The breakfast she had been preparing sat forgotten on the counter, coffee growing cold, toast burning in the toaster, as she tried to process documents that defied every assumption she had about divorce, about Richard, and about the man she thought she had known for 30 years. "This can't be right," she whispered to herself, flipping back to the first page to check if she had somehow received someone else's papers by mistake. But there it was. Catherine Elizabeth Sterling versus Richard James Sterling, and terms that seemed more like a fantasy than a legal document. The sound of the front door opening made her heart race. Richard had been staying at their Lake Tahoe cabin for the past month, giving her space to process their separation while they worked out the details of their divorce. His return now, on the same day these papers arrived, couldn't be a coincidence. "Catherine?" his voice called from the foyer. "I know the papers were delivered today. We should probably talk." She found him in the living room, looking remarkably calm for a man who had just proposed to give away everything he had spent his adult life building. At 62, Richard still commanded attention. Silver hair, intelligent eyes, the bearing of someone accustomed to making decisions that affected hundreds of people. But today, there was something different about him, a peace she hadn't seen in years. "Richard, I don't understand these papers." "There has to be some mistake." "There's no mistake, Catherine. Please sit down." She remained standing, the divorce settlement clutched in her hands like evidence of insanity. "You're giving me the entire company? The house? Everything? Richard, this doesn't make sense." "It makes perfect sense to me." "No, it doesn't." Her voice rose, and she realized she was more upset by his generosity than she had been by their decision to divorce. "People don't do this, Richard. Husbands don't give their entire fortune to wives who are leaving them. Maybe they should." Catherine walked to the window, looking out at the garden she had cultivated over the years, another thing she would apparently now own outright, according to the papers. "Are you trying to make me feel guilty? Is this some kind of manipulation to make me change my mind about the divorce?" "No, Catherine. I'm trying to set you free." She turned to face him, confusion and anger warring in her expression. "Free? Richard, I told you I wanted a divorce, not to become some kind of charity case or recipient of your guilt money. That's not what this is." "Then what is it? Because I've read these papers 3 times, and what you're proposing is insane. You're giving me a construction company worth $47 million. You're giving me investments, properties, cash settlements. You're giving me more money than I could spend in several lifetimes. Richard stood and walked to his desk, retrieving a folder he had prepared for this conversation. Catherine, do you remember what you told me the night you asked for a divorce? You said you wanted to discover who you are when you're not Richard Sterling's wife. Yes, but you said you wanted to travel, take art classes, volunteer with causes that matter to you. You said you wanted to figure out who Catherine Morrison could become. Richard, I can do those things without owning your entire company. Can you? He opened the folder, revealing financial projections and cost analyses she hadn't expected. Catherine, do you know how much it costs to travel the way you've talked about wanting to travel? Not tourist travel, but extended stays in places where you can really understand the culture, take intensive art courses, volunteer with organizations that require long-term commitments. She stared at him, unsure where he was going with this line of reasoning. Do you know what it costs to start a non-profit organization? To fund causes you care about at a level where you can make real change? To have the financial independence to make every decision based on what you want to do rather than what you can afford to do? Richard, I never asked for that level of... No, you didn't ask for it. But I'm offering it because I want to see what happens when someone has unlimited resources to pursue their authentic self. Catherine sank into the chair across from his desk, the divorce papers scattered around her. This is about your ego, isn't it? You can't stand the idea that someone might leave Richard Sterling, so you're trying to make it impossible by overwhelming me with generosity. Catherine, if this were about my ego, I'd be fighting the divorce, not facilitating it. Then explain it to me, because what you're proposing doesn't make sense from any angle I can see. Richard sat down across from her, and for the first time in months they were having a conversation where they were really looking at each other instead of past each other. 3 weeks ago, you told me that you had spent 30 years pretending to love me because leaving seemed financially complicated and socially awkward. Do you remember saying that? Yes, but Richard, you said you felt trapped by circumstances, that you chose security over authentic feelings because the alternative seemed impossible. Catherine nodded, uncertain where this was leading. What I realized after our conversation is that I didn't want you to love me out of gratitude or obligation any more than I wanted you to stay married to me for financial security. If you had continued pretending to love me for another decade, we both would have wasted another 10 years of our lives. I understand that, but, Catherine, you were honest with me. Brutally, painfully honest. You could have had an affair and let me discover it. You could have made my life miserable until I wanted the divorce. Instead, you told me the truth, even though it hurt us both. Richard leaned forward, his voice growing more intense. You freed me from a marriage based on pretense. Now I want to free you from every external pressure that might make you choose pretense over authenticity in the future. Catherine stared at him, beginning to understand, but still resistant to the implications. So you're giving me a fortune to ensure I never have to make decisions based on financial need. I'm giving you the resources to make every decision for the rest of your life based purely on what you want, not on what you can afford or what other people expect. Richard, that's an enormous responsibility. That's more money than most people can even imagine. Yes, it is, and I'm curious to see what you do with it. Catherine stood and began pacing, the magnitude of his proposal starting to sink in. What if I make terrible decisions? What if I waste the money on foolish investments or donate it to causes you think are worthless? Then you'll have made your own mistakes with your own resources, and I'll respect your right to do that. What if I use the money to travel the world and never come back to Denver? What if you never see me again? Then I'll know you found something in the world that made you happier than anything you could find here. Catherine stopped pacing and stared at him. What if I fall in love with someone else and use your money to build a life with them? For the first time, Richard hesitated before answering. This was the possibility that tested his resolve most severely. The idea that his generosity might fund Catherine's romance with another man. Then I'll know that you found the kind of love I wasn't able to give you, and I'll be grateful that you had the resources to pursue it without compromise. You can't mean that. Catherine, for 30 years I loved the idea of you loving me. I was so focused on being loved that I never learned how to love without expecting something in return. This is my chance to find out what unconditional love actually feels like. Catherine sat back down, the divorce papers forgotten, as she tried to process the emotional complexity of what Richard was offering. This isn't normal, Richard. This level of generosity towards someone who's leaving you, it's not healthy. Maybe not. But staying married to someone who doesn't love you isn't healthy either. At least this way, we're both free to discover what healthy actually looks like for us. Lee. They sat in silence for several minutes, the weight of Richard's proposal settling between them. Finally, Catherine spoke again. What happens to you? If you give me everything, what's left for your life? Enough money to live comfortably, 2 beautiful properties, and for the first time in 35 years, the freedom to decide what I actually want to do with my time instead of what I think I should do. And what do you think you want to do? Richard smiled. I have no idea. And that's the most exciting thing I've felt in years. Catherine picked up the divorce papers again, scanning through terms that would make her one of the wealthiest women in Colorado. Richard, I need time to think about this. I need to talk to lawyers, financial advisors, people who can help me understand what you're really proposing. Of course, take all the time you need. And I need you to promise me something. What? I need you to promise that this isn't some elaborate scheme to win me back, that you're not hoping I'll be so overwhelmed by your generosity that I'll fall in love with you and call off the divorce. Richard stood and walked to the window, looking out at the city where he had built his business and his reputation. Catherine, I promise you that I want this divorce to proceed exactly as you originally requested. I don't want you to stay married to me out of gratitude any more than I wanted you to stay married to me out of obligation. He turned back to face her. What I want is to see who Catherine Morrison becomes when she has unlimited resources and complete freedom. And I want to find out who Richard Sterling becomes when his identity isn't defined by being your husband or by owning a construction company. Even if those people have nothing to do with each other, especially if those people have nothing to do with each other. Catherine left that afternoon with the divorce papers and a promise to give Richard her answer within 2 weeks. As she drove through the Denver suburbs, where they had built their life together, she found herself seeing everything differently. The house they had shared for 15 years, now potentially hers alone. The country club, where they had been members, where she could continue going, but as Catherine Morrison rather than Catherine Sterling. The charitable organizations where she had volunteered, where she could now become a major donor rather than just another volunteer. But more than the material implications, Catherine was struggling with the emotional reality of Richard's offer. The man she had thought she knew, conventional, predictable, focused on security and social status, was proposing something that seemed almost recklessly generous. Either Richard Sterling was having some kind of breakdown, or he was capable of a kind of love that she had never imagined possible. And for the first time since asking for a divorce, Catherine Morrison found herself genuinely curious about the man she had been married to for 30 years. 18 months after Catherine signed the most unusual divorce settlement in Colorado legal history, she stood on the terrace of her villa in Tuscany, watching the sunset paint the vineyards in shades of gold and amber. In her hands, she held a letter that had arrived that morning, the first direct communication she had received from Richard since their divorce was finalized. The past year and a half had transformed her life beyond recognition. True to Richard's vision, the unlimited resources had freed her to make choices based purely on desire rather than necessity. She had traveled to 17 countries, studied art in Florence, learned photography in Vietnam, and volunteered with clean water projects in Kenya. She had donated millions to causes that moved her, started a foundation focused on education for girls in developing countries, and discovered passions she never knew existed. But more importantly, she had discovered who Catherine Morrison was when she wasn't trying to be anyone's version of the perfect wife. The letter bore Richard's familiar handwriting, but the return address was from Montana, where she knew he had retreated to his ranch after their divorce. Dear Catherine, I hope this letter finds you well, and that your travels have brought you the joy and discovery you were seeking when we divorced. I have followed your foundation's work through news reports and mutual friends, and I am deeply proud of what you have accomplished. I am writing to share some news that I thought you should hear directly from me. 3 months ago, I was diagnosed with early-stage pancreatic cancer. The prognosis is cautiously optimistic, but the treatment will be extensive and the outcome uncertain. Catherine's hands began to tremble as she read, the peaceful evening suddenly shattered by news she hadn't expected. I want to be clear that I am not writing to seek sympathy or to suggest that this changes anything about our decision to divorce. I remain convinced that ending our marriage was the right choice for both of us, and I have no regrets about the settlement terms or the path our lives have taken since. However, there are some legal and practical matters we need to discuss. My will currently names you as the primary beneficiary of my remaining estate, which includes the Montana Ranch, the Lake Tahoe cabin, and my investment portfolio. Given our divorce, you may prefer that these assets go elsewhere.